Good to see you. Welcome to all of you who are with us online. We got to try to get Lazarus out of the grave today. I hope you enjoyed the little clip at the end of last week's class with the Chosen showing the way that they demonstrated that in their video series. I thought it was really, really well done. If you haven't seen it, I would suggest that you do that. It's available on YouTube. Just look for The Chosen, Lazarus, something like that, anything like that in the search engine, and it'll bring it up for you on YouTube. Well, we want to look at the text a little bit today, and there's some interesting and kind of unusual things about it. Just to get us back all on the same page, where we're talking about now is in Bethany, and I don't know if you can read the small print or not, but the three red dots, the one on the left is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Go across the Kidron Valley and up and over the Mount of Olives and through another valley, and you end up in Bethany. So it's a Sabbath day's journey is about roughly 3/4 of a mile. So Bethany would be around 2 Sabbath day journeys. It's a little less than 2 miles from the Temple Mount.
Lanny, how wide are these valleys?
Not very. I walked across the Kidron, and it's just yeah, it's almost yards. I mean, you can throw a rock across it easily. It's steep, and when the first time I was there, when we came off of the Mount of Olives, going down through the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Kidron Creek, and back up to the Temple Mount, it was misty rain, and we were walking down an asphalt road, and it was very, very slick. And I felt like I needed to sit down and just scoot down, but I didn't. I walked and made it. But it's rather steep, but it's not. I mean, you just eyeball to eyeball almost with the Temple Mount when you're standing on the Mount of Olives. This is just another look at it on a different type of a modern map. You can see on the far right, we talked about this last week, the town of Bethany has been renamed. It's under Palestinian control, and they named it El Zaria, which the English for that is Lazarus. And I'm always amazed that the Palestinians, the Arabians, would rename a city for a biblical story, and one of especially this high importance, the resurrection of Lazarus. Of course, they do have the traditional tomb for Lazarus there, so that's a tourist attraction. I haven't been, we haven't gone in any of our trips, but it's there, and a lot of tourists do go there. So there is some financial incentive, I guess, to highlight that for them. They do like to have the American dollars in the Palestinian-controlled areas. They also control Bethlehem, and they draw a lot of money from tourists. Or they did, of course, before the war. I don't guess they're getting anything now, or very little right now, but anyway, that's the location. Now, when he gets through here in Bethany, they're going to go back up, and we'll get to this a little bit later on, but they're going to go back up north, this time on the west side of the Jordan River, to a community called Ephraim, And the area of Ephraim up there, which was part of the division to the tribes back when the land was first divided by Joshua. But there's a community up there that in our translations at least is called Ephraim. There's some question about exactly what the name of the town is and exactly where it is. But he's going to go up there because it's suddenly becoming very, very dangerous for him to be in Jerusalem. So they're getting out of town for a while, and they're going to wait up there, not too long, but until the time of the Passover. And then they're going to come back for the Passover. And of course, that'll be his last trip into Jerusalem. Okay, so we'll look at the text a little bit. This is in the 11th chapter of John. John's the only one who records this event, which I find a little bit interesting. You'd think that something of this profundity would have been in all of the Gospels, but for whatever reason, John's the only one that records it. Of course, John records a number of things that are not in the other three. You know, the other three are called the synoptic gospel because they're pretty similar. John's not of that same cut, and it's, of course, written quite a bit later than the others were written also. John writes this very late in the first century. So a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. And we'll get to that in due course too. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death." Had I shown you the full clip of the Chosen, there is a scene where the messenger brings the written message to Jesus from Mary and Martha relative to the illness of their brother Lazarus, and Jesus reads it and is moved by it, and then intentionally crumbles it up and pitches it into the fire. Just adding a little context to it. Jesus said Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. There's several things here that are kind of unusually stated. In fact, he knows, and indeed, Lazarus' sickness does end in death, but it doesn't end in death, right? It ends in death, but it doesn't end in death. He's going to die, but that's not the end of it. There's another part of the story. There's the rest of the story. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But the disciples objected. "Rabbi," they said, "only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" They were not really anxious to go back. You remember not long ago we had the story of the Jesus on Solomon's porch, and the Jewish leaders taking up stones and running them out of the city, attempting literally to take their lives. Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there's danger of stumbling because they have no light." Kind of a strange answer to their question. The disciples have just said, "Jesus, are you sure you want to go back to Judea? Because don't you remember? Have you forgotten that they were trying to kill you just a few days ago?" And Jesus gives this very cryptic response. And this is really quite typical of the way rabbis interacted with their disciples. It wasn't usually a very straightforward thing. A lot of times they would respond with a question. But in this case, he gives this parable, as it were, of the 12 hours of daylight and the 12 hours of darkness. Thoughts about what he was trying to say with that? He said, why are you going back? And he says, well, there's 12 hours of daylight and there's 12 hours of dark, and you walk safely in the day, but you don't walk safely at night. Any ideas? Not all at once? Well, I'm not sure that I know all of it either, but here's a thought on it. Jesus uses a metaphor of a day being divided into 12 hours of daylight to illustrate the concept of divine time. There's a time for everything, and God has a plan. And it fits into the rhythm of things. Jesus perhaps is saying that he has a set amount of time to accomplish his mission. As long as he operates within God's will and timing, he's safe, just as a person walking during the day is safe. Yes, I know that they tried to kill me, but if I'm doing God's will, then I'm walking in daylight. I'll be okay. If I'm not walking in God's will, then I'm walking at night. And in this response, at least, he's going to say, that's not a safe thing to do. Does that make sense at all? I'm not sure that captures it or not. Sometimes we criticize the disciples because they were so slow in coming to understand what Jesus was trying to tell them. And then we come to this and we say, well, yeah, okay, I'm kind of slow too. I'm not sure exactly what the message is. Then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus was dead. They jumped on that in a hurry because they did not want to do what? They did not want to go back to the area of Jerusalem. Well, if he's just sleeping, we don't have to go. No, that's not what he meant. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. This idea of falling asleep as a euphemism for death was fairly common in the ancient world, and we still hear it today, don't we? But in ancient Israel, sleep conveys the idea that death is not final, that sleep is something you wake up from, so it's not annihilation. Multitudes who sleep in that's from Daniel 12, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Psalm 13 says, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. There seems to be an evolving of thought about the life after death within the biblical record. By the time of the first century, the Pharisees had developed a more detailed concept of death and resurrection. And we saw this and talked about it in the story, the account of the rich man and Lazarus, which is rather detailed and rather specific, right? And I think that was probably pretty representative of the way that the Pharisees looked at the afterlife at that time. Jesus is using this as a metaphor that he's asleep. That doesn't say anything about whether he was conscious of where he was or was not conscious of where he was. He was just using it as a way of describing his condition. But the disciples missed it, and he made it very clear to them, that no, he wasn't talking about just a passing sleep. He was talking about death. Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go to and die with Jesus." That's pretty fatalistic. I think sometimes we give Thomas kind of a little bit of a bad rap because he was the one that, after the resurrection, he's the one that was missing as the first appearance, and he said, I'm not going to believe it unless I can stick my hands in his scars. I just won't believe it. So we give him the name Doubting Thomas, and we kind of subjugate him a little bit, I guess. But really, he was a rather prominent and in many ways commendable one of the disciples. He just saying, if you go back to Jerusalem, they're going to kill you, and I'm ready to go with you, and whatever they do to you, they can do to me. And he's inviting his fellow disciples to go with him. Incidentally, it seems like there's really developing this rapport among this chosen 12 here, and using the word fellow disciples. It connotates the idea that they have congealed into a group. They know that they're a group, and they recognize their position in that division. So when Jesus arrived in Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Is there any particular significance to it being specified that it was 4 days? Any thoughts?
I'm not really sure that there's a specific significance to 4 other than that 4 is the number for the world cosmos. But one thing that is definite is that he was there long enough that he was definitely dead.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that was put in there. Maybe that the 4 was also symbolic, but it's more likely it's just that they're trying to say he truly was dead, or he wouldn't have been in that.
He's not in a swoon.
No, he's not. He's not sleeping. He's not swooning.
The proof of the stench that came from the
The proof was the smell. And there's some speculation on this, and I think that's certainly appropriate. But there was actually a first century Jewish belief that a dead person's spirit would hover over his remains for up to 3 days before moving on. And in that context, the idea of the 4 is that, hey, the spirit's done given up on this body and it's moved out. Now, I don't know how common that was or how widespread that was, but the historians say that was a factor. Unrelated to that, but just because my mind works this way, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a great fear of people being buried alive, and medicine hadn't progressed to the point where it has today. So they couldn't be as certain about when the moment of death occurred. And there was this horror of being buried and reviving. And so they literally, and I don't know how widespread this was, but it was done. This is a historical fact. They would actually create what they call these safety coffins. And they would bury these things, but there would be a cord that would go down into the grave and was attached to the corpse, maybe to a finger or the hand or some part of the body, that would be easily moved, that would be first to move. And then that went up to a bell above ground. And so if the corpse resuscitated, came back to life, it would ring the bell and people could go dig him up. So you've heard the phrase, well, that rings a bell? Some people have credited it to that. I don't know that that's true or not. But anyway, like I say, they didn't put a bell on Lazarus' tomb. I'm not suggesting anything, but I just thought about that as I was going through it. So Bethany was about 15 stadia or furlongs, or less than 2 miles, down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. And when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, and she called him Lord, the Greek word Kyrie, which is master. If only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God, Theos, will give you whatever you ask. It sounds like Martha is saying, if you ask God, God can resurrect Lazarus. I don't know that that's going to conflict with the following statement, as we'll see in just a minute. But it's kind of a there's faith there. There's faith in Jesus, and we're going to see that she fully recognizes him and confesses him as Messiah. But it's just kind of weirdly worded. One thing that some of the commentators do point out is that there is a progression of faith on Martha's part. At this point, she sees Jesus as Kyrie, as Master, as Messiah. But when she talks about resurrection, she doesn't recognize him as having the power to do that. She says, God can do that. And if you ask him, maybe he would do it for you. So there's a level of faith at this point. Let's see what comes next. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Now see, here Martha says, yes, I know he's going to rise, just like everyone else, at the resurrection, at the last day. So that's why the previous statement sounds a little strange to me, right? Not sure exactly what to do with that. And then Jesus makes this very profound statement. He tells her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. And there's another kind of strange wording in the English, at least. You'll live after you die, but you will never, ever die. So I guess it's back to what we were talking about earlier. It's an acknowledgement of what we all know, physical death. But physical death is not death. It's just a transition. It's just going from one state to another state.
That reminds me of the thief on the cross, where he told him, we all know that they all died on the cross, but then they were resurrected again.
If you didn't hear the first part of that, he said that reminds him of the thief on the cross. The thief on the cross died, but went immediately into a state of paradise, consciousness, wherever Jesus went. But it's just, it's an interesting way of talking about it. You're going to live after you die, but you're never going to die. So that's the way I make sense of it. Anything to add, David? Yeah, spiritual death, but it's even more than that. I mean, it's just a transition. We call it death. He calls it living forever. Yeah, door you pass through. And he asked Martha, "Do you believe this?" I am the resurrection. What a powerful statement. In that, Jesus is declaring his death over his power over death itself, and of course, he's going to demonstrate this first by raising Lazarus. He's already had 2 occasions where he's raised the dead that we know about, that are written for us. But he's also, of course, going to demonstrate it himself. Resurrection isn't just a future event, but something that already exists in him. He will confirm it soon in his own resurrection. Jesus as the life, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. As the life, it transcends death. It merges our present life in him, our physical death, and our resurrection into one continual unit of existence where death is merely a transition from one state to another. And that is our great hope, our great faith, our great trust, and the basis of why we worship who we worship and why we do what we do, right? I am the resurrection. I'm not going to be, I already am. The resurrection is guaranteed and assured and demonstrated in me now. Yes, Lord, she told him, I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. So this is, again, the progression of faith, because she is just about to learn in just a few minutes much more than that. Then she will return to Mary. Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave, and then, depending on your translation, to mourn or to weep, and probably wail is a better word. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. This is going to be repeated 4 times. We're going to hear it from Martha. We're going to hear it from Mary. We're going to hear it from the assembled crowd. And then we're going to hear it from the mourners at the grave. 4 times they're going to repeat. If you had only been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping or wailing and saw the other women wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply, depending on your translation, moved or troubled. One translation says groaned in his spirit. Why was Jesus so angry? Why was he so troubled? That's not a rhetorical question. Somebody? Right back here. David?
I think he was upset because they had not believed him enough. Their faith was not deep enough to, instead of greeting him with anger or with, why weren't you here earlier? It's too late. They should have been greeting him, thank you, Savior, you're here, and we love you. And then let him do what he was going to do to demonstrate his power and to show those around that he had a power to bring someone back to life. And as they studied that, they would realize that only the Son of God could have done that. So when they were doubtful and upset themselves, he didn't expect that. He didn't want that.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And we're seeing Jesus now become more frustrated with his close disciples and associates not being able to come to grips with what he's been telling them over and over and over again.
I believe that he looks back on the Roman official whose faith was so deep and amazed at how he caught on, and then his own people were so superficial, they were just skimming the surface. They couldn't get the true message that he was trying to tell.
I think there's another hand back there, I think I saw.
I agree. It seems like it was a yo-yo effect. One moment, one event, they have all of this faith in Jesus. The next time they don't. And so I think that in itself would say, that really troubled him, that they weren't consistent, as someone was saying, in their faith.
Okay. Come around, Jeff. Here's some other thoughts on it. And this is what you've just been talking about. Anger at death itself. I think there was a frustration with the reality and the devastation that death itself brings to humanity. I think it was, as you said, there was a lack of faith, anger over a lack of faith in his closest friends. He was emotional because of his deep compassion and empathy for those suffering, right? For their fears and tears and pain. I think he felt their grief. We'll see that more in a minute when it comes to the next statement that Jesus wept. Go ahead, Jeff.
And for you're in John first. Well, okay. Anyway, in the 11th thing, will be no. Pardon me. In 11th, and wherever you are, there won't be no tear. I mean, and no pain or no tears in whenever we leave the earth.
Absolutely. You got it, brother.
Okay,
Thank you.
you.
So Jesus asked, where have you put him? They told him, Lord, come and see. And then Jesus wept. And people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. And the word loved here is not the agape love that we see a lot in Scripture. This is the philo word, which is the familiar, the brotherly love. This is Jesus loving a friend Lazarus, loving his friends Mary and Martha. So why did he cry? He knows that he's going to raise him from the dead. Why did he weep? Right in the back, David.
I think that he just didn't want his friend to be in that kind of pain and agony and have to go through death. I believe he felt that for all of the family. And you know the song that says, does Jesus care? when our heart is pain, too troubled for mirth. But anyway, I think that's why. Because, he could feel what they were feeling,
Yeah.
even though he knew that they should have enough faith not to be feeling like that. They did. And I think he's troubled when we're troubled.
Sure.
And when he went up there and he thought about, he'd been dead, and it's just, he was a very emotional person, I'm sure.
Right.
Empathy. Most of us have been around people who have lost, like at a funeral. And when you see their tears, you feel their pain and their loss. And Christ Jesus had a deep empathy for the loss and the weeping that was coming. And so I think he couldn't have not wept, because he could feel it, and he knew his sadness. So that's kind of why I think he
Yeah.
All this sadness, when we lose someone, we look for comfort so that we can move on. I can see in my own imagination that he saw the suffering, and that hurt him too. But he had to do this to show who, that he was really the one. And I can see him realizing that this is only temporary. They're going to have to go through this losing him again. And I can see that being part of his sadness as well, knowing that, okay, I have to do this, but they're going to go through this again, and I hate to see that coming.
Yeah. A few thoughts on that, and you've mentioned most of them. His weeping reveals his humanity, right? Jesus wept as a man who felt pain, sorrow, and compassion just as we do. He understands our suffering and enters into it with us. He is an empathetic high priest described in Hebrews 4:15, who can sympathize with our weakness. Shows his divinity. He remained aware of his divine power to conquer death. His tears do not signify helplessness, but rather deep love and care. And then, as Mike just said, he's bringing Lazarus back, and I don't think that was Lazarus' first choice, because he is going to die again. And he's coming back from a much better place. So those are some thoughts. Thank you. But some said, this man helped a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? That's the fourth time it's mentioned. Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told him. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. He thanked God for hearing him, but he did not ask God to raise Lazarus from the grave. He did it himself. And this is what I'm talking about, the progression of faith. Now Martha can see that Jesus is this divine power who is the resurrection himself. Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And some people said he had to be careful that he made sure and named Lazarus, or else there'd be dead people coming out all over the place. I don't know if that's true or not. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in the headcloth. Jesus told him, unwrap him and let him go. Many of the Jews who were with them, who had come to visit Mary, believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. That's the most remarkable verse in the Bible, I think. Many of the people who saw Lazarus come out of the dead believed in Jesus. What about the ones who saw Lazarus come out of the grave and didn't believe in Jesus? What would it take if you were standing there and watched a man call a man who had been dead 4 days out of the grave, and you still didn't believe? I think that's kind of beyond hope, isn't it? But some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. I love the little play on words they put into the Chosen where they made one of those people there a Sadducee. And somebody said, don't you know you made the Sadducee mad? Well, the Sadducees don't believe in life after death. And they're sitting here looking at one. So that would not bode too well. So what happened to Lazarus after he came back? And we're going to wrap up with this. And this is all extra biblical. This has nothing to do with Scripture. It's not in there, so don't go looking for it. But it is in tradition, and it's in very old tradition. This goes all the way back to the first century, second century at least, not to the first, but the second. And there's quite a bit of it, and some of it's pretty spectacular. According to Eastern Orthodox Church tradition, after the resurrection of Christ, Lazarus was forced to flee Judea because of rumored plots on his life and came to Cyprus. Now that makes sense, because if you remember, the Pharisees, we're going to come to this in a little bit next week, when the Pharisees get word of this, they want to kill Jesus. But who else do they want to kill? They want to kill Lazarus, because Lazarus is the living proof of Jesus. So what do? You get rid of him. So that's not too far-fetched. Now, Cyprus, if you don't remember, is an island. It's there in the Mediterranean, not far from Greece, Athens, Greeks. There he was appointed by Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas made, that was part of their missionary journey, was to go to Cyprus. And he was appointed by Paul and Barnabas as the first bishop of, I can't pronounce that, Kitian. Today it's called Larnaca. He lived there for 30 more years, and on his death was buried there for the second and last time. I don't know if that's true or not. It's true that it is tradition. And then it gets more interesting. According to Saint Epiphanius, bishop of Constantia in Cyprus, righteous Lazarus was 30 years old at the time, and he lived another 30 years after being raised. So he died around the age of 60 for the second time. According to tradition, Lazarus never smiled during the 30 years after his resurrection. I've seen that several different places. Worried by the sight of unredeemed souls he had seen during the 4 days he was dead. The only exception was when he saw someone stealing a pot, and he smiled and said, "The clay steals the clay." It gets more interesting. In 890 AD, a tomb was found in Larnaca bearing the inscription, "Lazarus, the friend of Jesus, the friend of Christ." Emperor Leo VI of Byzantium and had Lazarus' remains transferred to Constantinople. That's today's Istanbul. Then in 1204 AD, the Crusaders carried the saint's relics to Marseille, France, as part of the booty of war. From there, later on, they disappeared, and up to the present day, they've not been traced. So Lazarus has seen a lot of traveling since he died. If that is true. In recompense to Larnaca, the Emperor Leo had the Church of St. Lazarus, which still exists today, erected over Lazarus' tomb there on the island of Cyprus. And the marble sarcophagus can be seen inside the church, the one that has his name on it, under the Holy of Holies. A lot of the Eastern Orthodox churches have an area in their basilica or whatever they have that is designated as the Holy of Holies. All right, so that's the story of Lazarus. Take it or leave it. Our time is up. Thank you for your participation, and have a wonderful God bless week.